Welcome to Helping Organisations Thrive. Today I have the pleasure of Dr. Laura Gallaher. Welcome to you, Laura.
Thank you for having me.
You are an organisational psychologist, a professional speaker, a best-selling author of The Missing Links, launching a high-performing company culture. From being hired by NASA to change culture following the Columbia accident, to working with Disney to lead shifts in performance management for leaders, to inspiring Yahoo's global teams to transform inside out. So we are going to be exploring the NASA accident happened in 2003 and all about culture and culture change and psychological safety. But before we get into that, Laura, what do you love about what you do?
Oh my gosh, so much. The first two thoughts that come up for me they both feel very selfish, but one is that I feel like I'm student number one of all of the work that I do. And so my ability to work with people who are also focused on growing their own self-awareness and self-acceptance keeps it as that constant reminder at the forefront for me so that I can continue on my own journey and continue to grow and feel more fulfilled in life. And the other thing I would say is just the insights that I get to see people have and the impact it has on their life is just I get chills from it. It's really, really powerful stuff.
Oh, that's fantastic. Sounds great. Sounds like you love what you do, which is great.
I do. I do. I feel very fortunate, very grateful.
That's fantastic. I want you to take us back to 2003 and the Columbia sort of NASA disaster, and just talk us through what happened and a little bit about perhaps what led up to that and some of the start of your work that sort of came out of that.
Absolutely. So, the Space Shuttle Columbia accident, as you mentioned, happened in 2003. And, a lot of people, when they think about space shuttle disasters and NASA's history, their mind goes straight to Challenger because Challenger happened in the 80s. And that tragedy, NASA lost Challenger during the launch. And so, that image is much more just powerful and salient in people's minds. But Columbia happened almost 2 decades later, and Columbia was actually lost on reentry. So much fewer eyes. Almost nobody was actually watching this happen. It was only after we had discovered what happened that media outlets started to really show whatever was captured in terms of the wreckage. So what happened with Columbia? During the final launch, there was a piece of foam that fell off of the external tank of the whole shuttle system, and it hit the orbiter. But it was so far into the launch that all the cameras, there's over 130 cameras that are pointed at the shuttle every time it launches, but none of them could capture exactly where the foam hit. They could just see that it struck the orbiter somewhere. And there were actually 3 different teams across the agency that had all seen this foam strike, is what it was called, and they were really concerned about it. But they kind of had the deck stacked against them because well before this higher governing body at NASA said that foam strikes were not an in-flight issue. It's important for people to understand that every single time there was a shuttle mission, there were all kinds of anomalies. There were always so many different things like, hey, this didn't go exactly right, or we have to look into this. And so NASA had to work to differentiate and say, what are the highest priority things for us to stay focused on? What do we think poses a real threat? What doesn't? What can wait until after the mission? And so foam strikes have been designated as something that didn't pose a safety risk to the astronauts. Because what a lot of people didn't realize is that foam had been hitting the orbiter for years. It had happened many, many times. However, what had happened in the past is that the foam was hitting on the underbelly of the orbiter that had the really thick tiles as part of the heat shield. And this time, what they couldn't quite tell and didn't know for sure is that unfortunately, this time the foam hit the leading edge of the wing, and it was reinforced carbon-carbon, not nearly as strong as those extra thick tiles that are on the underbelly of the orbiter. And so what they didn't know is that there was a very large hole in the wing of Columbia. And so when Columbia got the green light to come back to Earth, unfortunately, the heat shield failed, and NASA lost all 7 astronauts. And so that was the technical explanation that the investigation was able to provide as far as what happened. But the investigation said that NASA's culture was as much to blame for the
Mm.
accident as the foam itself. And for a lot of people, they would think, okay, so NASA had a bad culture. People didn't like working there. People were disengaged. They didn't care about the mission or just whatever you think of when you think of not having a good culture. But NASA was just rated the number one place to work in the federal government in the US just a couple months before this happened. And so it raised really important questions then about what is culture? Because apparently it's not enough just to be super engaged and love what you do and be dedicated to the mission and, oh, by the way, have some of the smartest people on the planet, literal rocket scientists, Nobel Prize winners. And so there was a big culture change initiative, and my now business partner, Dr. Philip Mead, was asked to lead the culture change initiative at Kennedy Space Center, which is here in Florida. And then he learned that there's an entire field called organizational psychology. So he hired me and a team of organizational psychologists to come in and work with him on the culture at NASA Kennedy Space Center.
Wow, that's interesting. And so when they obviously came out with this, there was a culture problem.
Mhm.
What were they picking up? Bearing in mind, you just said they were voted, the best place to work in the federal government that of the
Yeah.
previous year. So what was it about the culture that they were picking up on that wasn't good, and that almost got to that place that potentially you could say caused a disaster or was a contributing factor to that?
Yeah. Well, and one of the things that we we decided to do to create meaningful differentiation, because I think that there would be people still today who would say like, no, NASA had a good culture. And so we started to use more of the language of, is it an effective culture? Because you can have highly engaged employees, you can even improve the quality of the employees' lives. But if your culture is not actually driving success for you, mission success or success in the market or whatever your business has said, this is what success means to us, then you don't have a truly effective culture. And we realized that it's a very complex adaptive system, right? These organizations, there's so many factors. So I know we only have a short time. I'll just hit on like a couple of the key things. But they found that there were all of these invisible forces that were heavily influencing people's thought processes, both consciously and subconsciously. It was impacting how they were communicating with each other and it was impacting their decision making. So, at the organizational level, one of the big challenges they found came down to organizational design. They had the mission manager who was supposed to be equally responsible for schedule and budget, but also technical and safety. It's just way too much for one single person to be able to hold in their head. And so, from an org design perspective, one of the big changes was made to pull safety out, to pull engineering and technical out, and really work to give everybody more an equal seat at the table. So, you don't have things like schedule and budget overemphasizing or over influencing the direction of the
Mm.
decisions that are made. Because at more of a societal level, the shuttle program was constantly on the chopping block at that point. There was always this looming threat that perhaps the shuttle program was going to be canceled and it wouldn't be funded anymore. We're about 20 plus years now into the shuttle program at this point. So many of the people working at NASA, this was their life. It was a huge part of their identity was the shuttle program. The amount of pride they had and, I am a shuttle engineer. I am a shuttle program manager.
Mm.
It ran really deep for them. And so this looming threat of the program being canceled, one of the mantras that people would have is save the program. And save the program meant we have to stay on schedule. They had countdown clocks until this is the deadline for when we have to finish the space station. Because I'm not sure how much you follow the space program, but there's always delays, right? There's always things that come up. And because NASA generally does want to focus a lot on safety, they will always push back the schedule when they're concerned about safety. But more and more, it was starting to feel like we might actually lose the shuttle program if we aren't keeping things on time. And so it was just having this subtle or not so subtle influence on What are people really valuing most when they're making decisions about what to do? Where is their energy? Where is their attention? Where is their focus?
I guess it almost created another mission, as in save the program,
Yeah.
almost overarched what they're there for as an organization. And did that?
Mm-hmm.
It felt like where you're talking about it, it's almost been driven by a bit of fear, isn't it? Of something could be
Yes,
lost, isn't it? Which then you make
absolutely.
all sorts of strange decisions and not the wisest way of working sometimes when you're under fear.
Absolutely. And, you can also hear that mantra and think that it doesn't sound negative, right? These are people that believe in the program. We use this really kind of silly example, Julian, to drive this point home sometimes. If you imagine standing on a skyscraper and there's a big beam extending out over the street, if there was $100 bill at the end of that beam, would you walk out, say 50 feet to go get that $100 bill?
No.
No, I wouldn't either. I've not yet found somebody that says yes to that.
Yeah, and
Okay.
I wouldn't even be watching anybody do it neither.
Oh no, I know I couldn't do it either. But now imagine that at the end of that beam is your child, right? Or a dear loved one, somebody that you care about deeply. Are you going to go now to the end of that beam
I'll
and
give it a
rescue
go.
that child?
I would
Or give it
definitely
a
give it
go,
a go.
right? And that's what happens is that when we have this deep love for something, we start to become riskier and riskier in our decision making. And this is happening on a subconscious level. So nobody was intentionally making decisions to say, well, this might be a threat to the astronauts, but schedule's more important. It's not operating at that level. It's operating at the subconscious level, which is why a huge part of the work that we did was really working with, especially the leaders, to help them grow their self-awareness, become more aware of what are the factors that are influencing your decision. And because we can't rely on any one person to be able to store all this in their mind, the ability to effectively communicate becomes huge. So, the other variable that became really important is how are people communicating here? And I'd mentioned that this higher governing body had said that foam strikes weren't an issue. So, imagine that you're an engineer at NASA and you have a gut feeling that something is wrong. We've watched the video of the foam strike, but you don't have any data to back you up. There are literally walls inside the buildings at NASA that say, "In God we trust, all others must bring data." So to be an engineer who's going to now
That's on the walls, is it?
yeah, in
Really?
some buildings, it's
Wow.
literally painted on the walls, and it's definitely a mantra. And so just imagine the amount of vulnerability that you would feel as an engineer if you were contemplating standing up in front of, 30, 50 people, managers at multiple levels above you in the organization and saying, I just have a bad feeling. I don't have any data to back it up. And I know that we say failure's not an option here, but I just really think that like something might go terribly, terribly wrong. Like nobody wanted to do that. Nobody wanted to be Chicken Little. And so they were using a lot of unofficial channels of communication, trying to work through people that they knew and trusted to see, can we possibly get imagery? They were looking to see, can we get satellites repositioned so that we can just get a look at Columbia and just see if there's any damage? Which, by the way, if they did discover that there was damage, there was no clear plan for what to do. Like they didn't have this written into any kind of manual or handbook. What do you do if you discover there's a hole in the wing? And so there's also, it's like this problem that we're not supposed to be focused on right now that, hey, if we discover it is a problem, we have no idea how to solve it. And it wasn't a very small ask. It's a big ask. This is an interagency thing. This would require going to the Department of Defense. And I believe it would have been spending millions of dollars even to reposition satellites. It would have completely disrupted the mission. So like, this is not a small ask. And all these unofficial channels, they were looking to request imagery. But because they weren't going through proper channels and because of this prior decision that was made, there was no official requirement. So when it made it to the mission
It's
manager,
interesting, isn't it? Because safety was the prerequisite of all of the obviously ventures they would have done, and yet
yeah.
nobody felt they could share, or they were using other channels. How did you change that sort of culture? Because that's quite ingrained for 20 odd years of that
Mhm.
programming going on, and people feeling if things are on the wall saying "in God we trust," but you got to make sure you bring data to
Hmm.
do anything, and you don't, and you got to have sometimes gut feels or a little bit of wisdom or experience. What did you do? And obviously, I'm thinking people might be listening now, thinking actually, I'm in an organisation similar to this. That I feel I can't say anything, or I have to sort of justify everything through a graph or research.
Yeah.
How did you change that sort of culture of sharing and perhaps a bit more gut feel?
So part of it came down to working to shift the burden of proof, so to speak. Here in the US legal system, we at least like to say that the burden is on the prosecution, right? They have to prove something beyond a shadow of a doubt. Excuse me. And that was one of the shifts in the culture, was to say, instead of trying to make somebody prove that something might be a problem, let's shift it so that you prove to me that there's not a problem. And so that was one way to elevate safety again in terms of the criteria of how do we decide what to do. The other thing that's really important to keep in mind about NASA, and yes, safety is important, but you cannot with a straight face say that safety was the highest priority for NASA. It
Mm.
wasn't. It's not it is not safe above all else to stick human beings on a rocket with that much fuel. I don't remember the like however many millions of pounds, whatever, but that much rocket fuel, light it on fire and send it into space and say safety is our top priority. It's not. The highest priority was about exploration. It was about working to move humankind forward. Safety was a very important consideration, but
Mm.
we always knew as an agency, like we are taking risks with life. And so to know that it was never actually truly paramount, it was never actually truly the absolute highest priority also makes it tricky because we acknowledge that there is inherent risk in space
Mm.
travel. So that was a big part of it. But mostly what we wanted to do was focus on helping the leaders create psychological safety. Are you familiar with this term?
I am indeed, yeah.
Yeah. And so this was coined by Dr. Amy Edmondson in 1999. And it really is about, does it feel like if you speak up about something, maybe admit a mistake, or if you admit you don't understand something that's going on, or you're going to disagree with somebody, maybe especially the boss, does it feel emotionally safe to do that? In other words, do you feel like you're going to get punished if you do? Do you think you're going to get demeaned or belittled or put down or retaliated against? Do you
Mm.
think you're going to get a reputation as having, you're chicken little? You think the sky is falling? What's the vibe? What is the culture? Psychological safety says that you can absolutely be vulnerable here and you're not going to feel punished for it later. And so that's an oversimplification of what psychological safety is. But this was really key because it wasn't strong enough inside NASA at the time of the Columbia accident for the concerned people to speak up past a certain point. Because they did speak up, but they were also told at a certain point, like, you got to let this go, right? There's no requirement. You got to let this go. And what happens at that point when they really feel like they've hit a wall is their subconscious kind of takes over and begins to rationalize. So they don't think to themselves, well, it's probably going to be a life and death disaster, but I care about my career more. That's not what's happening. At the subconscious level, the brain starts to rationalize and say, well, I guess, it's probably going to be okay. Because they didn't have that emotional safety to be able to speak up and say, hey, I really feel bad about this. I know I don't have data, but like my gut says something is different about this foam strike.
And was it through your boss's, I suppose, work with NASA that he realised that this psychological safety was not great? It wasn't very feeling not emotionally safe. And what were the steps that you did to try and change that? Because obviously you don't do this overnight. And again, people are listening and now we're thinking, how can we sort of shift my own culture to where people do speak up more, do challenge the status quo or challenge leadership, obviously done in a respectful way,
Mhm.
to create a culture that is open for innovation, contributions, and pointing out potential mistakes or potential areas of concern that maybe the people might have.
Yeah, and you're right that it's not something that is fixed overnight. In fact, that's part of why I was there for almost 8 years, and even today, the organization development function still exists inside NASA. I think that one of the differences from the Challenger accident and the Columbia accident is that NASA realized that we can't change culture once and consider it to be done. We want to be able to get really clear about our culture, what we want the culture to be, and then we need to have a constant presence that is there to help us measure it and monitor it and enhance it. And so much of there, I mean, there were a bunch of things that were done in the near term, including like literally there was a leader behavior checklist that would be behaviors that are actually observable. So in a meeting, somebody could be there with a checklist and observe how the leader was interacting in a meeting to see, are they exhibiting the behaviors that we are looking for them to exhibit? So it did get very prescriptive, especially in the beginning.
This is people observing in meetings. Oh, wow. Okay.
That's right. And obviously letting leaders know about all of these behaviors to say these are key. Also, I mentioned, save the program was one of those phrases or mantras that ended up being very misguided. And so if that ever came up in a meeting, there was a protocol to like pause, stop the meeting, stop whatever you're talking about. And we're not going to have this whole conversation about what we learned about the impact of that. On a more ongoing way, though, the thing about psychological safety is the vast majority of leaders are never trying to harm psychological safety. Like just about every leader that I've ever worked with, if I was to say, do you want your people to be open with you? Do you want them to be willing to disagree with you? Do you want them to tell you if they think that perhaps you might be wrong in your decision making? They're all going to tell me yes. Like, yes, of course I want to know. I don't want a bunch of yes men on my team. But majority of harm that's done to psychological safety is also done through these subconscious defense mechanisms. So a leader is sending out signals that leads people to think it's not safe, but they're not doing it on purpose. And so that's where so much of the work became about how can we help each leader grow their own self-awareness. So it became a lot about introspection, understanding what are the defense mechanisms that are coming into play that are impacting how people are perceiving you. And of course, the individual employee also has a sense of responsibility because it's always up to them if they speak up or not. And so much of our work was about teaching the leaders and the employees how to have these open channels of communication, how to work to really get on the same page and make sure that they're giving and receiving feedback on a much more regular basis.
It must have been quite intense for the leaders to have this observation going on and this constant reviewing. It must have been quite a tough time to try and shape him. And it's interesting to talk about that sort of more introspection and about the leader. And from my own experience, it's the leader that changes the culture of psychological safety and the impacts that I talk a lot about. Role modeling is really powerful. The leader then challenges their boss in front of other people, and not in a look at me type of thing, but just being more conscious of that impact of actually they can see somebody else do it and think, okay, it's okay to challenge around here, or it's okay for my boss, he's just shared a mistake and told everybody what he learned from that. And that type of vulnerability, I think that's where
exactly.
And I think I had this I can't think of the guy's name. I came on my show a few years ago, talks about psychological safety, and he says one of his definitions is where vulnerability is rewarded. And so when you've got high vulnerability in leaders, that's rewarded through people's sense of, I can be vulnerable then because my leader is as well.
Yes, 100%. I completely agree with what you're saying. I think the role modeling is huge. And the signals, what are the signals that you send? And I love that definition too, that gentleman had of, to what extent is vulnerability rewarded? And it doesn't mean necessarily like we're giving an actual award or you're getting a financial bonus for it. It's really about the interpersonal interaction. So if a leader in an organization is saying, I would like us to go down path A, and somebody on the team raises a hand and says, I've got a lot of concerns actually about going down path A. I'd really love for us to consider path B. What is the leader's immediate response? Because often there is a subconscious defensive reaction that can pop up where the leader wants to defend. They want to defend why they want to do path A, or there's just little things that can come out in their tone of voice and their facial expressions because there's part of them that's feeling like they want to kind of protect feeling good about themselves and their own intelligent decision making. Small little things can make a big difference. So if those subconscious defense mechanisms are popping up, then that's going to send the signal of, oh, yeah, don't disagree. Don't disagree. That didn't go well. In contrast, if the leader is really willing to slow down, take note of their own immediate reactions that they might feel in that moment, and choose to respond with openness and say, okay, well, hey, I want us to feel really good about whatever decision we make. So let's pause on making a decision and make sure we have some more discussion. Tell me more about what you're thinking, Jack, or whatever. That signal, that is rewarding vulnerability. It's like, I'm going to give you more space. I'm going to give you more time. I'm going to thank you for bringing something up. So it's these little micro moments that can really matter the most and how they add up. And people form an opinion about you as a leader to say, does this person really want feedback? Do they really want to be disagreed with? Are they really open? Am I going to get judged if I make a mistake? So really noticing what are the signals that I'm sending. And because we're all self-deceived as human beings, it's a constant journey of self-awareness to become more and more clear about how am I reacting to other people, especially if I'm stressed out, especially if I'm tired, right? Like we can all be really great when we're feeling really great and things are aligning, but how consistently are you as a leader able to show up in a way that continues to send signals of this is a safe environment for you to be vulnerable?
Yeah, because we revert to type, don't we? When we're in stressed situations, and and I talk to a lot of leaders about, it's your behaviour that will change people around you. People will see difference in you, and that changes it on what you say. Obviously, what you say is important as well, but it's the behaviour that's matched by that. And I think it's important to recognise that. And you talked there about that self-reflection piece and being self-aware, and it's getting to a place where almost after significant meetings or significant moments with your team, it's just to reflect on, was I creating the right environment there? Was I, listening? Was I engaged? All the various things you can think about that situation. And because, we're not perfect, we do make mistakes, but it's that learning, isn't it? Continual sort of learning and understanding ourselves and thinking, how can I do it better next time with that team for, next
100%.
week's meetings.
And I love what you're saying, Julian, about we all make mistakes and none of us are perfect, because we don't teach any of this as a perfection model. This is a recovery model. And in fact, if you're listening to this and you're like, oh man, I maybe just did that yesterday in a meeting, or something like that, it is not too late to put recovery into place. Your willingness, especially as a leader, your willingness to come back to a situation and own it in front of everybody who was present for the moment of, to say, you know what, I was thinking about it and I don't love how I responded yesterday. I do think I was stressed, and that's not an excuse. And I just really wanted to apologize to you for maybe shutting that down when I didn't mean to. You are actually building so much trust when you do something like that. That show of self-accountability is a wonderful way to repair those little moments of rupture. And I'll often compare it sometimes to the practice of building muscles, right? So if you're going to the gym or you're doing push-ups or whatever, and you want to grow your muscles, what you're literally doing is you're working the muscles until they tear. And it's those torn muscles that are then working to rebuild that actually makes the muscle stronger. And so the same thing can often be true when you're talking about having trust on a team and working to create that psychological safety. If they see that you as a leader are willing to walk back and recognize that you made a mistake, you have that level of humility, you have enough self-acceptance to allow you to do that, then you're actually potentially setting yourself up for an even stronger path forward at that point.
Fantastic. Absolutely. And how quickly did the change happen within NASA from all this? Or noticeable, I should say.
Yeah, so the accident was in 2003, and I believe that Congress had grounded the shuttle fleet. Congress would not allow NASA to fly their shuttles again until they had demonstrated that there was a significant enough change in the culture. And I believe that it was the 4th of July, which is our Independence Day here in the US of 2005.
Okay.
It might have been 2006. I got to check history on that. But yeah, it took a couple years before they said, okay, we trust that you are now safe to fly the rest of the shuttle missions out. And they did until the shuttle program retired in 2011.
Wow. Okay. And from your perspective and your understanding, what do you think is the most important lesson organization should take from this event?
To me, it's the recognition that the most important thing any company can do to really drive their business performance is to optimize the human dynamics. Organizations are just groups of people, right? It's human beings. And when you can understand the science of human behavior and then you can actually apply that science of human behavior, you can be unstoppable. People will talk about wanting to optimize a tech stack or, optimize a sales process or things like that. But what if you optimize the human dynamics? That touches literally every single thing in your business, human dynamics. So helping people better understand themselves, working to communicate, you can completely transform how people communicate by growing their self-awareness. You can significantly reduce blame inside organizations, which of course is defensive and triggers defensive behavior, which shuts down communication. Like that happens everywhere, but it's always getting in the way of your ultimate business potential. So I would say optimizing human dynamics is the number one thing any company can do to really, really drive performance.
And it makes very obvious sense. And I don't like to use resources as humans as resources, but in terms of your resources in an organization, it's the most expensive in terms of the cost to your balance sheet, and therefore you spend a lot more proportionate energy and investments to ensure that those are in a good place. And I say it's not just about being engaged and contributing, but actually feeling emotionally safe to make those sort of challenges and to obviously enjoy their work, but to create that better performance. Because we know all the stuff we've talked about, psychological safety and engagement, there's studies that have been done that not only say it's a powerful thing to get to, but also it affects the bottom line. If you knuckle it down to financials, you get greater performance, therefore you get greater sales, therefore you get greater profit or better missions, whatever it may be, or higher, better KPIs within your organization. So there's a great positive in it all, rather than just saying, oh, we need to invest in our people, but actually there's some real positives to your organization we'll get from it.
Absolutely.
Really appreciate the call, the conversation, Laura. If people want to get in touch with you and connect with you, what's the best way of doing that?
I would say the best way to do that is find me on LinkedIn. So I'm on there as Dr. Laura Gallaher. Just let me know that you heard me here on Julian's show, and I'd love to connect with you. And then we also have a free quiz, a free assessment I'd love to share if I could.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
So I'd mentioned, psychological safety and how much that is harmed by defensive behavior. But that defensive behavior actually is rooted in self-judgment. Like if I'm defensive, I'm defending myself against my own internal harsh judgments, right? Not other people. And so we have this quiz about your own self-acceptance. Like, what is your current level of self-acceptance? So it's just selfacceptancequiz.com. It's really short. It takes maybe 3 to 5 minutes for people to complete. And once you do, you'll get a report right away that says, hey, based on how you've answered these items, this is a snapshot in time of where you are in this moment. And then you'll get a series of coaching emails to follow up to help you see if you were interested in growing your self-acceptance, which is going to reduce your defensiveness and help you create that psychological safety. Here are some things that you can work on.
Oh, fantastic. Well, when that gets released onto the podcast platforms, we'll include a link in that. That'd be great.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you for your time today, Laura.
Thank you for having me.